Chapter 25 of The Rise of Silas Lapham by William Dean Howells. Lapham awoke confused, and in a kind of remoteness from the loss of the night before, through which it loomed mistily. But before he lifted his head from the pillow, it gathered substance and weight against which it needed all his will to bear up and live. In that moment he wished that he had not wakened, that he might never have wakened. But he rose and faced the day and its cares. The morning papers brought the report of the fire and the conjectured loss. The reporters somehow had found out the fact that the loss fell entirely upon Lapham. They lighted up the hackneyed character of their statements with the picturesque interest of the coincidence that the policy had expired only the week before. Heaven knows how they knew it. They said that nothing remained of the building but the walls, and Lapham, on his way to business, walked up past the smoke-stained shell. The windows looked like the eye-sockets of a skull down upon the blackened and trampled snow of the street. The pavement was a sheet of ice, and the water from the engines had frozen like streams of tears down the face of the house, and hung in icy tags from the window-sills and copings. He gathered himself up as well as he could, and went on to his office. The chance of retrieval that had flashed upon him as he sat smoking by that ruined hearth the evening before stood him in such stead now as a soul hope may, and he said to himself that, having resolved not to sell his house, he was no more crippled by its loss than he would have been by letting his money lie idle in it. What he might have raised by mortgage on it could be made up in some other way, and if they would sell he could still buy out the whole business of that West Virginia company, mines, plant, stock on hand, goodwill, and everything, and unite it with his own. He went early in the afternoon to see Bellingham, whose expressions of condolence for his loss he cut short with as much politeness as he knew how to throw into his impatience. Bellingham seemed at first a little dazzled with the splendid courage of his scheme. It was certainly fine in its way, but then he began to have misgivings. "I happen to know that they haven't got much money behind them," urged Lapham. "They'll jump at an offer." Bellingham shook his head. "If they can show profit on the old manufacture, and prove they can make their paint still cheaper and better hereafter, they can have all the money they want, and it will be very difficult for you to raise it if you're threatened by them. With that competition you know what your plant at Lapham would be worth, and what the shrinkage on your manufactured stock would be. Better sell out to them," he concluded, "if they will buy." "There ain't enough money in this country to buy out my paint," said Lapham, buttoning up his coat in a quiver of resentment. "Good afternoon, sir." Men are but grown-up boys after all. Bellingham watched this perversely proud and obstinate child fling petulantly out of his door, and felt a sympathy for him which was as truly kind as it was helpless. But Lapham was beginning to see through Bellingham, as he believed. Bellingham was, in his way, part of that conspiracy by which Lapham's creditors were trying to drive him to the wall. More than ever now he was glad that he had nothing to do with that cold-hearted, self-conceited race, and that the favors so far were all from his side. He was more than ever determined to show them, every one of them, high and low, that he and his children could get along without them, and prosper and triumph without them. He said to himself that if Penelope were engaged to Corey that very minute, he would make her break with him. He knew what he should do now, and he was going to do it without loss of time. He was going on to New York to see those West Virginia people. They had their principal office there, and he intended to get at their ideas, and then he intended to make them an offer. He managed this business better than could possibly have been expected of a man in his impassioned mood. But when it came really to business, his practical instincts, alert and wary, came to his aid against the passions that lay in wait to betray after they ceased to dominate him. He found the West Virginians full of zeal and hope, but in 10 minutes he knew that they had not yet tested their strength in the money market, and had not ascertained how much or how little capital they could command. Lapham himself, if he had had so much, would not have hesitated to put $1 million into their business. He saw, as they did not see, that they had the game in their own hands, and that if they could raise the money to extend their business, they could ruin him. It was only a question of time, and he was on the ground first. He frankly proposed a union of their interests. He admitted that they had a good thing, and that he should have to fight them hard, but he meant to fight them to the death unless they could come to some sort of terms. Now the question was whether they had better go on and make a heavy loss for both sides by competition, or whether they had better form a partnership to run both paints and command the whole market. Lapham made them 3 propositions, each of which was fair and open: to sell out to them altogether, to buy them out altogether, to join facilities and forces with them, and go on in an invulnerable alliance. Let them name a figure at which they would buy, a figure at which they would sell, a figure at which they would combine, or, in other words, the amount of capital they needed. They talked all day, going out to lunch together at the Astor House, and sitting with their knees against the counter on a row of stools before it, for 15 minutes of reflection and deglutition, with their hats on, and then returning to the basement from which they emerged. The West Virginia Company's name was lettered in gilt on the wide low window, and its paint, in the form of ore, burnt and mixed, formed a display on the window-shelf. Lapham examined it and praised it. From time to time they all recurred to it together. They sent out for some of Lapham's paint and compared it, the West Virginians admitting its former superiority. They were young fellows and country persons like Lapham by origin, and they looked out with the same amused, undaunted provincial eyes at the myriad metropolitan legs passing on the pavement above the level of their window. He got on well with them. At last they said what they would do. They said it was nonsense to talk of buying Lapham out, for they had not the money, and as for selling out, they would not do it, for they knew they had a big thing. But they would as soon use his capital to develop it as anybody else's, and if he could put in a certain sum for this purpose, they would go in with him. He should run the works at Lapham, and manage the business in Boston, and they would run the works at Kanawha Falls, and manage the business in New York. The 2 brothers with whom Lapham talked named their figure, subject to the approval of another brother at Kanawha Falls, to whom they would write, and who would telegraph his answer, so that Lapham could have it inside of 3 days. But they felt perfectly sure that he would approve, and Lapham started back on the 11 o'clock train with an elation that gradually left him as he drew near Boston, where the difficulties of raising this sum were to be overcome. It seemed to him then that those fellows had put it on him pretty steep, but he owned to himself that they had a sure thing, and that they were right in believing that they could raise the same sum elsewhere. It would take all of it, he admitted, to make their paint pay on the scale they had the right to expect. At their age he would not have done differently, but when he emerged, old, sore, and sleep-broken, from the sleeping car in the Albany depot at Boston, he wished with a pathetic self-pity that they knew how a man felt at his age. A year ago, 6 months ago, he would have laughed at the notion that it would be hard to raise the money. But he thought ruefully of that immense stock of paint on hand, which was now a drug in the market, of his losses by Rogers and by the failures of other men, of the fire that had licked up so many thousands in a few hours. He thought with bitterness of the tens of thousands that he had gambled away in stocks, and of the commissions that the brokers had pocketed whether he won or lost. And he could not think of any securities on which he could borrow except his house in Nankeen Square, or the mine and works at Lapham. He set his teeth in helpless rage when he thought of that property out on the G.L.&P. that ought to be worth so much, and was worth so little if the road chose to say so. He did not go home, but spent most of the day shining round, as he would have expressed it, and trying to see if he could raise the money. But he found that people of whom he hoped to get it were in the conspiracy which had been formed to drive him to the wall. Somehow there seemed to be a sense of his embarrassments abroad. Nobody wanted to lend money on the plant at Lapham without taking time to look into the state of the business. But Lapham had no time to give, and he knew that the state of the business would not bear looking into. He could raise $15,000 on his Nankeen Square house, and another $15,000 on his Beacon Street lot, and this was all that a man who was worth $1 million by rights could do. He said $1 million, and he said it in defiance of Bellingham, who had subjected his figures to an analysis which wounded Lapham more than he chose to show at the time, for it proved that he was not so rich and not so wise as he had seemed. His hurt vanity forbade him to go to Bellingham now for help or advice, and if he could have brought himself to ask his brothers for money, it would have been useless. They were simply well-to-do Western people, but not capitalists on the scale he required. Lapham stood in the isolation to which adversity so often seems to bring men. When its test was applied, practically or theoretically, to all those who had seemed his friends, there was none who bore it, and he thought with bitter self-contempt of the people whom he had befriended in their time of need. He said to himself that he had been a fool for that, and he scorned himself for certain acts of scrupulosity by which he had lost money in the past. Seeing the moral forces all arrayed against him, Lapham said that he would like to have the chance offered him to get even with them again. He thought he should know how to look out for himself. As he understood it, he had several days to turn about in, and he did not let one day's failure dishearten him. The morning after his return he had, in fact, a gleam of luck that gave him the greatest encouragement for the moment. A man came in to inquire about one of Rogers's wildcat patents, as Lapham called them, and ended by buying it. He got it, of course, for less than Lapham took for it, but Lapham was glad to be rid of it for something, when he had thought it worth nothing, and when the transaction was closed, he asked the purchaser rather eagerly if he knew where Rogers was. It was Lapham's secret belief that Rogers had found there was money in the thing, and had sent the man to buy it. But it appeared that this was a mistake. The man had not come from Rogers, but had heard of the patent in another way, and Lapham was astonished in the afternoon when his boy came to tell him that Rogers was in the outer office and wished to speak with him. "All right," said Lapham, and he could not command at once the severity for the reception of Rogers which he would have liked to use. He found himself, in fact, so much relaxed toward him by the morning's touch of prosperity that he asked him to sit down. gruffly, of course, but distinctly. And when Rogers said in his lifeless way, and with the effect of keeping his appointment of a month before, "Those English parties are in town, and would like to talk with you in reference to the mills," Lapham did not turn him out of doors. He sat looking at him, and trying to make out what Rogers was after, for he did not believe that the English parties, if they existed, had any notion of buying his mills. "What if they're not for sale?" he asked. "You know that I've been expecting an offer from the G.L.&P." "I've kept a watch of that. They haven't made you any offer," said Rogers quietly. "And did you think," demanded Lapham, firing up, "that I would turn them in on somebody else as you turned them in on me, when the chances are that they won't be worth 10 cents on the dollar 6 months from now?" "I didn't know what you would do," said Rogers noncommittally. "I've come here to tell you that these parties stand ready to take the mills off your hands at a fair valuation, at the value I put upon them when I turned them in." "I don't believe you!" cried Lapham brutally, but a wild predatory hope made his heart leap so that it seemed to turn over in his breast. "I don't believe there are any such parties to begin with, and in the next place, I don't believe they would buy at any such figure, unless you've lied to them as you've lied to me. Did you tell them about the G.L.&P.?" Rogers looked compassionately at him, but he answered with unvaried dryness, "I did not think that necessary." Lapham had expected this answer, and he had expected or intended to break out in furious denunciation of Rogers when he got it, but he only found himself saying in a sort of baffled gasp, "I wonder what your game is." Rogers did not reply categorically, but he answered with his impartial calm, and as if Lapham had said nothing to indicate that he differed at all with him as to disposing of the property in the way he had suggested. "If we should succeed in selling, I should be able to repay you your loans, and should have a little capital for a scheme that I think of going into." "And do you think that I'm going to steal these men's money to help you plunder somebody in a new scheme?" answered Lapham. The sneer was on behalf of virtue, but it was still a sneer. "I suppose the money would be useful to you too just now." "Why?" "Because I know that you've been trying to borrow." At this proof of wicked omniscience in Rogers, the question whether he had better not regard the affair as a fatality and to yield to his destiny flashed upon Lapham, but he answered, "I shall want money a great deal worse than I've ever wanted it, before I go into such rascally business with you. Don't you know that we might as well knock these parties down on the street and take the money out of their pockets?" "They have come on," answered Rogers, "from Portland to see you. I expected them some weeks ago, but they disappointed me. They arrived on the Circassian last night. They expected to have got in 5 days ago, but the passage was very stormy." "Where are they?" asked Lapham, with helpless irrelevance, and feeling himself somehow drifted from his moorings by Rogers' shipping intelligence. "They are at Young's. I told them we would call upon them after dinner this evening. They dine late." "Oh, you did you?" asked Lapham, trying to drop another anchor, for a fresh clutch on his underlying principles. "Well, now, you go and tell them that I said I wouldn't come." "Their stay is limited," remarked Rogers. "I mentioned this evening, because they were not certain they could remain over another night. But if tomorrow would suit you better—" "Tell 'em I shan't come at all," roared Lapham, as much in terror as defiance, for he felt his anchor dragging. "Tell 'em I shan't come at all. Do you understand that?" "I don't see why you should stickle as to the matter of going to them," said Rogers. "But if you think it will be better to have them approach you, I suppose I can bring them to you." "No, you can't. I shan't let you. I shan't see them. I shan't have anything to do with them. Now do you understand?" "I inferred from our last interview," persisted Rogers, unmoved by all this violent demonstration of Lapham's, "that you wished to meet these parties. You told me that you would give me time to produce them. And I have promised them that you would meet them. I have committed myself." It was true that Lapham had defied Rogers to bring on his men, and had implied his willingness to negotiate with them. That was before he had talked the matter over with his wife, and perceived his moral responsibility in it, and even she had not seen this at once. He could not enter into this explanation with Rogers. He could only say, "I said I'd give you 24 hours to prove yourself a liar, and you did it. I didn't say 24 days." "I don't see the difference," returned Rogers. "The parties are here now, and that proves that I was acting in good faith at the time. There has been no change in the posture of affairs. You don't know now any more than you knew then that the G.L.&P. is going to want the property. If there's any difference, it's in favor of the road's having changed its mind." There was some sense in this, and Lapham felt it only too eagerly, as he recognized the next instant. Rogers went on quietly. "You're not obliged to sell to these parties when you meet them. But you've allowed me to commit myself to them by the promise that you would talk with them." "'Twa'n't a promise," said Lapham. "It was the same thing. They have come out from England on my guarantee that there was such and such an opening for their capital. And now what am I to say to them? It places me in a ridiculous position." Rogers urged his grievance calmly, almost impersonally, making his appeal to Lapham's sense of justice. "I can't go back to those parties and tell them you won't see them. It's no answer to make. They've got a right to know why you won't see them." "Very well, then," cried Lapham. "I'll come and tell them why. Who shall I ask for? When shall I be there?" "At 8 o'clock, please," said Rogers, rising, without apparent alarm at his threat, if it was a threat. "And ask for me. I've taken a room at the hotel for the present." "I won't keep you 5 minutes when I get there," said Lapham. But he did not come away till 10 o'clock. It appeared to him as if the very devil was in it. The Englishman treated his downright refusal to sell as a piece of bluff, and talked on as though it were merely the opening of the negotiation. When he became plain with them in his anger, and told them why he would not sell, they seemed to have been prepared for this as a stroke of business, and were ready to meet it. "Has this fellow," he demanded, twisting his head in the direction of Rogers, but disdaining to notice him otherwise, "been telling you that it's a part of my game to say this? Well, sir, I can tell you on my side that there isn't a slipperier rascal unhung in America than Milton K. Rogers." The Englishman treated this as a piece of genuine American humor, and returned to the charge with unabated courage. They owned now that a person interested with them had been out to look at the property, and that they were satisfied with the appearance of things. They developed further the fact that they were not acting solely or even principally in their own behalf, but were the agents of people in England who had projected the colonization of a sort of community on the spot, somewhat after the plan of other English dreamers, and that they were satisfied, from a careful inspection, that the resources and facilities were those best calculated to develop the energy and enterprise of the proposed community. They were prepared to meet Mr. Lapham, Colonel, they begged his pardon, at the instance of Rogers, at any reasonable figure, and were quite willing to assume the risks he had pointed out. Something in the eyes of these men, something that lurked at an infinite depth below their speech, and was not really in their eyes when Lapham looked again, had flashed through him a sense of treachery in them. He had thought them the dupes of Rogers, but in that brief instant he had seen them, or thought he had seen them, his accomplices, ready to betray the interests of which they went on to speak with a certain comfortable jocosity, and a certain incredulous slight of his show of integrity. It was a deeper game than Lapham was used to, and he sat down with a sort of admiration from one Englishman to the other, and then to Rogers, who maintained an exterior of modest neutrality, and whose air said, "I have brought you gentlemen together as the friend of all parties, and I now leave you to settle it among yourselves. I ask nothing and expect nothing, except the small sum which shall accrue to me after the discharge of my obligations to Colonel Lapham." While Rogers's presence expressed this, one of the Englishmen was saying, "And if you have any scruple in allowing us to assume this risk, Colonel Lapham, perhaps you can console yourself with the fact that the loss, if there is to be any, will fall upon people who are able to bear it, upon an association of rich and charitable people. But we're quite satisfied there will be no loss," he added savingly. "All you have to do is name your price, and we will do our best to meet it." There was nothing in the Englishman's sophistry very shocking to Lapham. It addressed itself in him to that easy-going, not evilly intentioned, potential immorality which regards common property as common prey, and gives us the most corrupt municipal governments under the sun, which makes the poorest voter, when he has tricked into place, as unscrupulous in regard to others' money as a hereditary prince. Lapham met the Englishman's eye, and with difficulty kept himself from winking. Then he looked away, and tried to find out where he stood, or what he wanted to do. He could hardly tell. He had expected to come into that room and unmask Rogers and have it over. But he had unmasked Rogers, without any effect whatever, and the play had only begun. He had a whimsical and sarcastic sense of its being very different from the plays at the theatre. He could not get up and go away in silent contempt. He could not tell the Englishmen that he believed them a pair of scoundrels, and should have nothing to do with them. He could no longer treat them as innocent dupes. He remained baffled and perplexed, and the one who had not spoken hitherto remarked, "Of course we shan't aggle about a few pounds, more or less. If Colonel Lapham's figure should be a little larger than ours, I've no doubt he'll be not too hard upon us in the end." Lapham appreciated all the intent of this subtle suggestion, and understood as plainly as if it had been said in so many words, that if they paid him a larger price, it was to be expected that a certain portion of the purchase money was to return to their own hands. Still he could not move, and it seemed to him that he could not speak. "Ring that bell, Mr. Rogers," said the Englishman who had last spoken, glancing at the annunciator button on the wall near Rogers's head, "and 'ave up something of, can't you? I should like to wet me whistle, as you say 'ere, and Colonel Lapham seems to find it rather dry work." Lapham jumped to his feet and buttoned his overcoat about him. He remembered with terror the dinner at Corey's, where he had disgraced and betrayed himself, and if he went into this thing at all, he was going into it sober. "I can't stop," he said. "I must be going." "But you haven't given us an answer yet, Mr. Lapham," said the first Englishman, with a successful show of dignified surprise. "The only answer I can give you now is no," said Lapham. "If you want another, you must let me have time to think it over." "But how much time?" said the other Englishman. "We're pressed for time ourselves, and we hoped for an answer." "'Oped for a hanswer," he corrected himself, "at once. That was our understandin' with Mr. Rogers." "I can't let you know till morning, anyway," said Lapham, and he went out, as his custom often was, without any parting salutation. He thought Rogers might try to detain him, but Rogers had remained seated when the others got to their feet, and paid no attention to his departure. He walked out into the night air, every pulse throbbing with a strong temptation. He knew very well those men would wait, and gladly wait till the morning, and that the whole affair was in his hands. It made him groan in spirit to think that it was. If he had hoped that some chance might take the decision from him, there was no such chance in the present or future that he could see. It was for him alone to commit this rascality, if it was a rascality, or not. He walked all the way home, letting one car after another pass him on the street, now so empty of other passing, and it was almost 11 o'clock when he reached home. A carriage stood before his house, and when he let himself in with his key, he heard talking in the family room. It came into his head that Irene had got back unexpectedly, and that the sight of her was somehow going to make it harder for him. Then he thought it might be Corey, come upon some desperate pretext to see Penelope, but when he opened the door he saw, with a certain absence of surprise, that it was Rogers. He was standing with his back to the fireplace, talking to Mrs. Lapham, and he had been shedding tears, dry tears they seemed, and they had left a sort of sandy, glistening trace on his cheeks. Apparently he was not ashamed of them, for the expression with which he met Lapham was that of a man making a desperate appeal in his own cause, which was identical with that of humanity, if not that of justice. "I some expected," began Rogers, "to find you here." "No, you didn't," interrupted Lapham. "You wanted to come here and make a poor mouth to Mrs. Lapham before I got home." "I knew that Mrs. Lapham would know what was going on," said Rogers more candidly, but not more virtuously, for that he could not, "and wished her to understand a point that I hadn't put to you at the hotel, that I want you should consider. I want you should consider me a little in this business, too. You're not the only one that's concerned, I tell you, and I've been telling Mrs. Lapham that it's my one chance, that if you don't meet me on it, my wife and children will be reduced to beggary." "So will mine," said Lapham, "or the next thing to it." "Well, then, I want you to give me this chance to get on my feet again. You've no right to deprive me of it. It's unchristian. In our dealings with each other we should be guided by the golden rule, as I was saying to Mrs. Lapham before you came in. I told her that if I knew myself, I should in your place consider the circumstances of a man in mine who had honorably endeavored to discharge his obligations to me, and had patiently borne my undeserved suspicions. I should consider that man's family, I told Mrs. Lapham." "Did you tell her that if I went in with you and those fellows, I should be robbing the people who trusted them?" "I don't see what you've got to do with the people that sent them here. They are rich people, and could bear it if it came to the worst. But there's no likelihood now that it will come to the worst. You can see yourself that the road has changed its mind about buying. And here I am without a cent in the world, and my wife is an invalid. She needs comforts, she needs little luxuries, and she hasn't even the necessaries, and you want to sacrifice her to a mere idea. You don't know in the first place that the road will ever want to buy, and if it does, the probability is that with a colony like that planted on its line, it would make very different terms from what it would with you or me. These agents are not afraid, and their principals are rich people. And if there was any loss, it would be divided up amongst them so that they wouldn't any of them feel it." Lapham stole a troubled glance at his wife, and saw that there was no help in her. Whether she was daunted and confused in her own conscience by the outcome, so evil and disastrous, of the reparation to Rogers which she had forced her husband to make, or whether her perceptions had been blunted and darkened by the appeals which Rogers had now used, it would be difficult to say. Probably there was a mixture of both causes in the effect which her husband felt in her, and from which he turned, girding himself anew, to Rogers. "I have no wish to recur to the past," continued Rogers, with growing superiority. "You have shown a proper spirit in regard to that, and you have done what you could to wipe it out." "I should think I had," said Lapham. "I've used up about $150,000 trying." "Some of my enterprises," Rogers admitted, "have been unfortunate, seemingly, but I have hopes that they will yet turn out well, in time. I can't understand why you should be so mindful of others now, when you showed so little regard for me then. I had come to your aid at a time when you needed help, and when you got on your feet you kicked me out of the business. I don't complain, but that is the fact. And I had to begin again, after I had supposed myself settled in life, and establish myself elsewhere." Lapham glanced again at his wife. Her head had fallen. He could see that she was so rooted in her old remorse for that questionable act of his, amply and more than fully atoned for since, that she was helpless, now in the crucial moment when he had the utmost need of her insight. He had counted upon her. He perceived now that when he had thought it was for him alone to decide, he had counted upon her just spirit to stay his own in its struggle to be just. He had not forgotten how she held out against him only a little while ago, when he asked her whether he might not rightfully sell in some such contingency as this, and it was not now that she said or even looked anything in favor of Rogers, but that she was silent against him, which dismayed Lapham. He swallowed the lump that rose in his throat, the self-pity, the pity for her, the despair, and said gently, "I guess you better go to bed, Persis. It's pretty late." She turned towards the door, when Rogers said, with the obvious intention of detaining her through her curiosity, "But I let that pass, and I don't ask now that you should sell to these men." Mrs. Lapham paused, irresolute. "What are you making this bother for, then?" demanded Lapham. "What do you want?" "What I've been telling your wife here. I want you should sell to me. I don't say what I'm going to do with the property, and you will not have an iota of responsibility, whatever happens." Lapham was staggered, and he saw his wife's face light up with eager question. "I want that property," continued Rogers, "and I've got the money to buy it. What will you take for it? If it's the price you're standing out for—" "Persis," said Lapham, "go to bed." And he gave her a look that meant obedience for her. She went out of the door and left him with his tempter. "If you think I'm going to help you whip the devil round the stump, you're mistaken in your man, Milton Rogers," said Lapham, lighting a cigar. "As soon as I sold to you, you would sell to that other pair of rascals. I smelt 'em out in half a minute." "They are Christian gentlemen," said Rogers, "but I don't purpose defending them, and I don't purpose telling you what I shall or shall not do with the property when it is in my hands again. The question is, will you sell? And if so, what is your figure? You have got nothing whatever to do with it after you've sold." It was perfectly true. Any lawyer would have told him the same. He could not help admiring Rogers for his ingenuity, and every selfish interest of his nature joined with so many obvious duties to urge him to consent. He did not see why he should refuse. There was no longer a reason. He was standing out alone for nothing, anyone else would say. He smoked on as if Rogers were not there, and Rogers remained before the fire as patient as the clock ticking behind his head on the mantel, and showing the gleam of its pendulum beyond his face on either side. But at last he said, "Well?" "Well," answered Lapham, "you can't expect me to give you an answer tonight, any more than before. You know that what you've said now hasn't changed the thing a bit. I wish it had. The Lord knows I want to be rid of the property fast enough." "Then why don't you sell to me? Can't you see that you will not be responsible for what happens after you have sold?" "No, I can't see that. But if I can by morning, I'll sell." "Why do you expect to know any better by morning? You're wasting time for nothing," cried Rogers in his disappointment. "Why are you so particular? When you drove me out of the business you were not so very particular." Lapham winced. It was certainly ridiculous for a man who had once so selfishly consulted his own interests to be stickling now about the rights of others. "I guess nothing's going to happen overnight," he answered sullenly. "Anyway, I shan't say what I shall do till morning." "What time can I see you in the morning?" 9:30. Rogers buttoned his coat, and went out of the room without another word. Lapham followed him to close the street door after him. His wife called down to him from above as he approached the room again. "Well?" "I told him I'd let him know in the morning." "Want I should come down and talk with you?" "No," answered Lapham, in the proud bitterness which his isolation brought. "You couldn't do any good." He went in and shut the door, and by his wife heard him begin walking up and down, and the rest of the night she lay awake and listened to him walking up and down. But when the first light whitened the window, the words of the Scripture came into her mind. "And there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." She could not ask him anything when they met, but he raised his dull eyes after the first silence, and said, "I don't know what I'm going to say to Rogers." She could not speak. She did not know what to say, and she saw her husband when she followed him with her eyes from the window drag heavily down toward the corner where he was to take the horse-car. He arrived rather later than usual at his office, and he found his letters already on his table. There was one, long and official-looking, with a printed letter heading on the outside, and Lapham had no need to open it in order to know that it was the offer of the great Lacustrine and Polar Railroad for his mills. But he went mechanically through the verification of his prophetic fear, which was also his sole hope, and then sat blankly looking at it. Rogers came promptly at the appointed time, and Lapham handed him the letter. He must have taken it all in at a glance, and seen the impossibility of negotiating any further now, even with victims so pliant and willing as those Englishmen. "You've ruined me," Rogers broke out. "I haven't a cent left in the world. God help my poor wife." He went out, and Lapham remained staring at the door which closed upon him. This was his reward for standing firm for right and justice to his own destruction, to feel like a thief and a murderer. Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Rise of Silas Lapham by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Margaret Espaillat. Later in the forenoon came the dispatch from the West Virginians in New York, saying their brother assented to their agreement, and it now remained for Lapham to fulfill his part of it. He was ludicrously far from able to do this, and unless he could get some extension of time from them, he must lose this chance, his only chance, to retrieve himself. He spent the time in a desperate endeavor to raise the money, but he had not raised the half of it when the banks closed. With shame in his heart he went to Bellingham, from whom he had parted so haughtily, and laid his plan before him. He could not bring himself to ask Bellingham's help, but he told him what he proposed to do. Bellingham pointed out that the whole thing was an experiment, and that the price asked was enormous, unless a great success were morally certain. He advised delay, he advised prudence, he insisted that Lapham ought at least to go out to Kanawha Falls and see the mines and works before he put any such sum into the development of the enterprise. "All that's well enough," cried Lapham, "but if I don't clinch this offer within 24 hours, they'll withdraw it and go into the market, and then where am I?" "Go on and see them again," said Bellingham. "They can't be so peremptory as that with you. They must give you time to look at what they want to sell. If it turns out what you hope, then I'll see what can be done, but look into it thoroughly." "Well," cried Lapham, helplessly submitting. He took out his watch and saw that he had 40 minutes to catch the 4 o'clock train. He hurried back to his office and put together some papers preparatory to going, and dispatched a note by his boy to Mrs. Lapham, saying that he was starting for New York, and did not know just when he should get back. The early spring day was raw and cold. As he went out through the office, he saw the clerks at work with their street coats and hats on. Miss Dewey had her jacket dragged up on her shoulders, and looked particularly comfortless as she operated her machine with her red fingers. "What's up?" asked Lapham, stopping a moment. "Seems to be something the matter with the steam," she answered, with the air of unmerited wrong habitual with so many pretty women who have to work for a living. "Well, take your writer into my room. There's a fire in the stove there," said Lapham, passing out. Half an hour later his wife came into the outer office. She had passed the day in a passion of self-reproach, gradually mounting from the mental numbness in which he had left her, and now she could wait no longer to tell him that she saw how she had forsaken him in his hour of trial, and left him to bear it alone. She wondered at herself in shame and dismay. She wondered that she could have been so confused as to the real point by that old wretch of a Rogers, that she could have let him hoodwink her so, even for a moment. It astounded her that such a thing should have happened, for if there was any virtue upon which this good woman prided herself, in which she thought herself superior to her husband, it was her instant and steadfast perception of right and wrong, and the ability to choose the right to her own hurt. But she had now to confess, as each of us has had likewise to confess in his own case, that the very virtue on which she had prided herself was the thing that had played her false, that she had kept her mind so long upon that old wrong which she believed her husband had done this man, that she could not detach it, but clung to the thought of reparation for it when she ought to have seen that he was proposing a piece of roguery as the means. The suffering which Lapham must inflict on him if he decided against him had been more to her apprehension than the harm he might do if he decided for him. But now she owned her limitations to herself, and above everything in the world she wished the man whom her conscience had roused and driven on whither her intelligence had not followed, to do right, to do what he felt to be right, and nothing else. She admired and revered him for going beyond her, and she wished to tell him that she did not know what he had determined to do about Rogers, but that she knew it was right, and would gladly abide the consequences with him, whatever they were. She had not been near his place of business for nearly a year, and her heart smote her tenderly as she looked about her there, and thought of the early days when she knew as much about the paint as he did. She wished that those days were back again. She saw Corey at his desk, and she could not bear to speak to him. She dropped her veil, that she need not recognize him, and pushed on to Lapham's room, and opening the door without knocking, shut it behind her. Then she became aware with intolerable disappointment that her husband was not there. Instead, A very pretty girl sat at his desk, operating a typewriter. She seemed quite at home, and she paid Mrs. Lapham the scant attention which such young women often bestow upon people not personally interesting to them. It vexed the wife that any one else should be seen to be helping her husband about business that she had once been so intimate with, and she did not at all like the girl's indifference to her presence. Her hat and sack hung on a nail in one corner, and Lapham's office coat, looking intensely like him to his wife's familiar eye, hung on a nail in the other corner, and Mrs. Lapham liked even less than the girl's good looks this domestication of her garments in her husband's office. She began to ask herself excitedly why he should be away from his office when she happened to come, and she had not the strength at the moment to reason herself out of her unreasonableness. "When will Colonel Lapham be in, do you suppose?" she sharply asked of the girl. "I couldn't say exactly," replied the girl, without looking around. "Has he been out long?" "I don't know as I noticed," said the girl, looking up at the clock, without looking at Mrs. Lapham. She went on working her machine. "Well, I can't wait any longer," said the wife abruptly. "When Colonel Lapham comes in, you please tell him Mrs. Lapham wants to see him." The girl started to her feet, and turned towards Mrs. Lapham with a red and startled face, which she did not lift to confront her. Yes, I will," she faltered. The wife went home with a sense of defeat mixed with an irritation about this girl which she could not quell or account for. She found her husband's message, and it seemed intolerable that he should have gone to New York without seeing her. She asked herself in vain what the mysterious business could be that took him away so suddenly. She said to herself that he was neglecting her. He was leaving her out a little too much, and in demanding of herself why he had never mentioned that girl there in his office, she forgot how much she had left herself out of his business life. That was another curse of their prosperity. Well, she was glad the prosperity was going. It had never been happiness. After this she was going to know everything as she used. She tried to dismiss the whole matter till Lapham returned, and if there had been anything for her to do in that miserable house, as she called it in her thought, she might have succeeded. But again the curse was on her. There was nothing to do, and the looks of that girl kept coming back to her vacancy, her disoccupation. She tried to make herself something to do, but that beauty, which she had not liked, followed her amid the work of overhauling the summer clothing, which Irene had seen to putting away in the fall. Who was the thing, anyway? It was very strange, her being there. Why did she jump up in that frightened way when Mrs. Lapham had named herself? After dark that evening, when the question had worn away its poignancy from mere iteration, a note for Mrs. Lapham was left at the door by a messenger who said there was no answer. "A note for me?" she said, staring at the unknown and somehow artificial-looking handwrite of the superscription. Then she opened it and read, "Ask your husband about his lady copying clerk. A friend and well-wisher," who signed the note gave no other name. Mrs. Lapham sat helpless with it in her hand. Her brain reeled. She tried to fight the madness off, but before Lapham came back the second morning it had become, with lessening intervals of sanity and release, a demoniacal possession. She passed the night without sleep, without rest, in the frenzy of the cruelest of the passions, which covers with shame the unhappy soul it possesses, and murderously lusts for the misery of its object. If she had known where to find her husband in New York, she would have followed him. She waited his return in an ecstasy of impatience. In the morning he came back, looking spent and haggard. She saw him drive up to the door, and she ran to let him in herself. "Who is that girl you've got in your office, Silas Lapham?" she demanded, when her husband entered. "Girl in my office?" "Yes. Who is she? What is she doing there?" "Why, what have you heard about her?" "Never you mind what I've heard. Who is she? Is it Mrs. M. that you gave that money to? I want to know who she is. I want to know what a respectable man with grown-up girls of his own is doing with such a looking thing as that in his office. I want to know how long she's been there. I want to know what she's there at all for." He had mechanically pushed her before him into the long darkened parlor, and he shut himself in there with her now, to keep the household from hearing her lifted voice. For a while he stood bewildered, and could not have answered if he would, and then he would not. He merely asked, "Have I ever accused you of anything wrong, Persis?" "You've no need to," she answered furiously, placing herself against the closed door. "Did you ever know me to do anything out of the way?" "That isn't what I asked you." "Well, I guess you may find out about that girl yourself. Get away from the door." "I won't get away from the door." She felt herself set lightly aside, and her husband opened the door and went out. "I will find out about her," she screamed after him. "I'll find out, and I'll disgrace you. I'll teach you how to treat me." The air blackened round her. She reeled to the sofa, and then she found herself waking from a faint. She did not know how long she had lain there. She did not care. In a moment her madness came whirling back upon her. She rushed up to his room. It was empty. The closet doors stood ajar and the drawers were open. He must have packed a bag hastily and fled. She went out and wandered crazily up and down till she found a hack. She gave the driver her husband's business address, and told him to drive there as fast as he could, and 3 times she lowered the window to put her head out and ask him if he could not hurry. 1,000 things thronged into her mind to support her in her evil will. She remembered how glad and proud that man had been to marry her, and how everybody said that she was marrying beneath her when she took him. She remembered how good she had always been to him, how perfectly devoted, slaving early and late to advance him, and looking out for his interests in all things, and sparing herself in nothing. If it had not been for her, he might have been driving a stage yet, and since their troubles had begun, the troubles which his own folly and imprudence had brought on them, her conduct had been that of a true and faithful wife. Was he the sort of man to be allowed to play her false with impunity? She set her teeth, and drew her breath sharply through them when she thought how willingly she had let him befool her, and delude her about that memorandum of payments to Mrs. M., because she loved him so much, and pitied him for his cares and anxieties. She recalled his confusion, his guilty looks. She plunged out of the carriage so hastily when she reached the office that she did not think of paying the driver, and he had to call after her when she had got halfway up the stairs. Then she went straight to Lapham's room, with outrage in her heart. There was again no one there but that typewriter girl. She jumped to her feet in a fright, as Mrs. Lapham dashed the door to behind her and flung up her veil. The 2 women confronted each other. "Why, the good land!" cried Mrs. Lapham. "Ain't you Zerrilla Millen?" I'm married," faltered the girl. "My name's Dewey now." "You're Jim Millen's daughter, anyway. How long have you been here?" "I haven't been here regularly. I've been here off and on ever since last May." "Where's your mother?" "She's here, in Boston." Mrs. Lapham kept her eyes on the girl, but she dropped, trembling, into her husband's chair, and a sort of amaze and curiosity were in her voice, instead of the fury she had meant to put there. "The Colonel," continued Zerrilla,
He's been helping us, and he's got me a typewriter, so that I can help myself a little. Mother's doing pretty well now, and when Hen isn't around we can get along." "That's your husband?" "I never wanted to marry him, but he promised to try to get something to do on shore, and Mother was all for it, because he had a little property then, and I thought maybe I'd better. But it's turned out just as I said, and if he don't stay away long enough this time to let me get the divorce—he's agreed to it time and again—I don't know what we're going to do." Zerilla's voice fell, and the trouble which she could keep out of her face usually, when she was comfortably warm and fed and prettily dressed, clouded it in the presence of a sympathetic listener. "I saw it was you when you came in the other day," she went on, "but you didn't seem to know me. I suppose the Colonel's told you that there's a gentleman going to marry me. Mr. Wemmell's his name, as soon as I get the divorce, but sometimes I'm completely discouraged. It don't seem as if I ever could get it." Mrs. Lapham would not let her know that she was ignorant of the fact attributed to her knowledge. She remained listening to Zerrilla, and piecing out the whole history of her presence there from the facts of the past and the traits of her husband's character. One of the things she had always had to fight him about was that idea of his that he was bound to take care of Jim Millen's worthless wife and her child because Millen had got the bullet that was meant for him. It was a perfect superstition of his. She could not beat it out of him, but she had to make him promise the last time he had done anything for that woman that it should be the last time. He had then got her a little house in one of the fishing ports, where she could take the sailors to board and wash for, and earn an honest living if she would keep straight. That was 5 or 6 years ago, and Mrs. Lapham had heard nothing of Mrs. Millen since. She had heard quite enough of her before, and had known her idle and baddish ever since she was the worst little girl at school in Lumberville, and all through her shameful girlhood, and the married days when she had made so miserable to the poor fellow who had given her his decent name and a chance to behave herself. Mrs. Lapham had no mercy on Moll Millen, and she had quarreled often enough with her husband for befriending her. As for the child, if the mother would put Zerrilla out with some respectable family, that would be one thing, but as long as she kept Zerrilla with her, she was against letting her husband do anything for either of them. He had done 10 times as much for them now as he had any need to, and she had made him give her his solemn word that he would do no more. She saw now that she was wrong to make him give it, and that he must have broken it again and again for the reason that he had given when she once scolded him for throwing away his money on that hussy. "When I think of Jim Millen, I've got to, that's all." She recalled now that whenever she had brought up the subject of Mrs. Millen and her daughter, he had seemed shy of it, and had dropped it with some guess that they were getting along now. She wondered that she had not thought at once of Mrs. Millen when she saw that memorandum about Mrs. M., but the woman had passed so entirely out of her life that she had never dreamt of her in connection with it. Her husband had deceived her, yet her heart was no longer hot against him, but rather tenderly grateful that his deceit was in this sort, and not in that other. All cruel and shameful doubt of him went out of it. She looked at this beautiful girl who had blossomed out of her knowledge since she saw her last, and she knew that she was only a blossomed weed, of the same worthless root as her mother, and saved, if saved, from the same evil destiny by the good of her father in her. But so far as the girl and her mother were concerned, Mrs. Lapham knew that her husband was to blame for nothing but his wilful, wrong-headed, kind-heartedness, which her own exactions had turned into deceit. She remained a while, questioning the girl quietly about herself and her mother, and then, with a better mind towards Zerrilla, at least, than she ever had before, she rose up and went out. There must have been some outer hint of the exhaustion in which the subsidence of her excitement had left her within, for before she had reached the head of the stairs, Corey came towards her. "Can I be of any use to you, Mrs. Lapham? The Colonel was here just before you came in, on his way to the train." "Yes, yes, I didn't know. I thought perhaps I could catch him here. But it don't matter. I wish you would let someone go with me to get a carriage," she begged feebly. "I'll go with you myself," said the young fellow, ignoring the strangeness in her manner. He offered her his arm in the twilight of the staircase, and she was glad to put her trembling hand through it, and keep it there till he helped her into a hack which he found for her. He gave the driver her direction, and stood looking a little anxiously at her. "I thank you. I'm all right now," she said, and he bade the man drive on. When she reached home she went to bed, spent with the tumult of her emotions, and sick with shame and self-reproach. She understood now, as clearly as if he had told her in as many words, that if he had befriended those worthless jades, the Millons characterized themselves so, even to Mrs. Lapham's remorse, secretly and in defiance of her, it was because he dreaded her blame, which was so sharp and bitter, for what he could not help doing. It consoled her that he had defied her, deceived her. When he came back she should tell him that, and then it flashed upon her that she did not know where he was gone, or whether he would ever come again. If he never came, it would be no more than she deserved, but she sent for Penelope, and tried to give herself hopes of escape from this just penalty. Lapham had not told his daughter where he was going. She had heard him packing his bag, and had offered to help him, but he had said he could do it best, and had gone off, as he usually did, without taking leave of any one. "What were you talking about so loud down in the parlor?" she asked her mother, just before he came up. "Is there any new trouble?" "No, it was nothing." "I couldn't tell. Once I thought you were laughing." She went about, closing the curtains on account of her mother's headache, and doing awkwardly and imperfectly the things that Irene would have done so skilfully for her comfort. The day wore away to nightfall, and then Mrs. Lapham said she must know. Penelope said there was no one to ask. The clerks would all be gone home, and her mother said, yes, there was Mr. Corey. They could send and ask him. He would know. The girl hesitated. "Very well," she said then, scarcely above a whisper, and she presently laughed huskily. "Mr. Corey seems fated to come in somewhere. I guess it's a providence, mother." She sent off a note inquiring whether he could tell her just where her father had expected to be that night, and the answer came quickly back that Corey did not know, but would look up the bookkeeper and inquire. This office brought him in person, an hour later, to tell Penelope that the Colonel was to be at Lapham that night and next day. "He came in from New York in a great hurry, and rushed off as soon as he could pack his bag," Penelope explained, "and we hadn't a chance to ask him where he was to be tonight. And mother wasn't very well, and I thought she wasn't looking well when she was at the office today, and so I thought I would come rather than send," Corey explained in his turn. "Oh, thank you." "If there is anything I can do, telegraph Colonel Lapham, or anything?" "Oh, no, thank you. Mother's better now. She merely wanted to be sure where he was." He did not offer to go upon the conclusion of his business, but hoped he was not keeping her from her mother. She thanked him once again, and said no, that her mother was much better since she had had a cup of tea, and then they looked at each other,
and without any apparent exchange of intelligence he remained, and at 11 o'clock he was still there. He was honest in saying he did not know it was so late, but he made no pretense of being sorry, and she took the blame to herself. "I oughtn't to have let you stay," she said. "But with father gone, and all that trouble hanging over us—" She was allowing him to hold her hand a moment at the door, to which she had followed him. "I'm so glad you could let me," he said, "and I want to ask you now when I may come again. But if you need me, you'll—" A sharp pull at the door-bell outside made them start asunder, and at a sign from Penelope, who knew that the maids were abed by this time, he opened it. "Why, Irene!" shrieked the girl. Irene entered with the hackman, who had driven her unheard to the door, following with her small bags, and kissed her sister with resolute composure. "That's all," she said to the hackman. "I gave my checks to the expressman," she explained to Penelope. Corey stood helpless. Irene turned upon him and gave him her hand. "How do you do, Mr. Corey?" she said, with a courage that sent a thrill of admiring gratitude through him. "Where's Mamma Pen? Papa gone to bed?" Penelope faltered out some reply embodying the facts, and Irene ran up the stairs to her mother's room. Mrs. Lapham started up in bed at her apparition. "Irene Lapham!" "Uncle William thought he ought to tell me the trouble papa was in, and did you think I was going to stay off there junketing while you were going through all this at home, and Pen acting so silly, too? You ought to have been ashamed to let me stay so long. I started just as soon as I could pack. Did you get my dispatch? I telegraphed from Springfield. But it don't matter now. Here I am. And I don't think I need have hurried on Pen's account," she added, with an accent prophetic of the sort of old maid she would become, if she happened not to marry. "Did you see him?" asked her mother. "It's the first time he's been here since she told him he mustn't come." "I guess it isn't the last time by the looks," said Irene, and before she took off her bonnet she began to undo some of Penelope's mistaken arrangements of the room. At breakfast, where Corey and his mother met the next morning before his father and sisters came down, he told her, with embarrassment which told much more, that he wished now that she would go and call upon the Laphams. Mrs. Corey turned a little pale, but shut her lips tight, and mourned in silence whatever hopes she had lately permitted herself. She answered with Roman fortitude, "Of course, if there's anything between you and Miss Lapham, your family ought to recognize it." "Yes," said Corey. "You were reluctant to have me call at first, but now if the affair is going on—" "It is. I hope. Yes, it is." "Then I ought to go and see her with your sisters, and she ought to come here, and we ought all to see her and make the matter public. We can't do so too soon. It will seem as if we were ashamed if we don't." "Yes, you are quite right, mother," said the young man gratefully, "and I feel how kind and good you are. I have tried to consider you in this matter, though I don't seem to have done so. I know what your rights are, and I wish with all my heart that I were meeting even your tastes perfectly. But I know you will like her when you come to know her. It's been very hard for her every way, about her sister, and she's made a great sacrifice for me. She's acted nobly." Mrs. Corey, whose thoughts cannot always be reported, said she was sure of it, and that all she desired was her son's happiness. "She's been very unwilling to consider it an engagement on that account, and on account of Colonel Lapham's difficulties. I should like to have you go, now, for that very reason. I don't know just how serious the trouble is, but it isn't a time when we can seem indifferent."
The logic of this was not perhaps so apparent to the glasses of 50 as to the eyes of 26, but Mrs. Corey, however she viewed it, could not allow herself to blench before the son whom she had taught that to want magnanimity was to be less than gentlemanly. She answered, with what composure she could, "I will take your sisters." And then she made some natural inquiries about Lapham's affairs. "Oh, I hope it will come out all right," Corey said, with a lover's vague smile, and left her. When his father came down, rubbing his long hands together, and looking aloof from all the cares of the practical world, in an artistic withdrawal, from which his eye ranged over the breakfast table before he sat down, Mrs. Corey told him what she and their son had been saying. He laughed, with a delicate impersonal appreciation of the predicament. "Well, Anna, you can't say but if you ever were guilty of supposing yourself porcelain, this is a just punishment of your arrogance. Here you are bound by the very quality on which you've prided yourself to behave well to a bit of earthenware who is apparently in danger of losing the gilding that rendered her tolerable." "We never cared for the money," said Mrs. Corey. "You know that." "No, and now we can't seem to care for the loss of it. That would be still worse. Either horn of the dilemma gores us. Well, we still have the comfort we had in the beginning. We can't help ourselves, and we should only make bad worse by trying. Unless we can look to Tom's inamorata herself for help." Mrs. Corey shook her head so gloomily that her husband broke off with another laugh. But at the continued trouble of her face he said sympathetically, "My dear, I know it's a very disagreeable affair, and I don't think either of us has failed to see that it was so from the beginning. I've had my way of expressing my sense of it, and you yours, but we have always been of the same mind about it. We would both have preferred to have Tom marry in his own set. The Laphams are about the last set we could have wished him to marry into. They are uncultivated people, and so far as I have seen them, I'm not able to believe that poverty will improve them. Still, it may. Let us hope for the best, and let us behave as well as we know how. I'm sure you will behave well, and I shall try. I'm going with you to call on Miss Lapham. This is a thing that can't be done by halves." He cut his orange in the Neapolitan manner, Chapter 27 of The Rise of Silas Lapham by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Margaret Espaillat. Irene did not leave her mother in any illusion concerning her cousin Will and herself. She said they had all been as nice to her as they could be, and when Mrs. Lapham hinted at what had been in her thoughts, or her hopes rather, Irene severely snubbed the notion. She said that he was as good as engaged to a girl out there, and that he had never dreamt of her. Her mother wondered at her severity. In these few months the girl had toughened and hardened. She had lost all her babyish dependence and pliability. She was like iron, and here and there she was sharpened to a cutting edge. It had been a life and death struggle with her. She had conquered, but she had also necessarily lost much. Perhaps what she had lost was not worth keeping, but at any rate she had lost it. She required from her mother a strict and accurate account of her father's affairs, so far as Mrs. Lapham knew them, and she showed a business-like quickness in comprehending them that Penelope never pretended to. With her sister she ignored the past as completely as it was possible to do, and she treated both Corey and Penelope with the justice which their innocence of voluntary offence deserved. It was a difficult part, and she kept away from them as much as she could. She had been easily excused, on a plea of fatigue from her journey, when Mr. and Mrs. Corey had called the day after her arrival, and Mrs. Lapham being still unwell, Penelope received them alone. The girl had instinctively judged best that they should know the worst at once, and she let them have the full brunt of the drawing-room, while she was screwing her courage up to come down and see them. She was afterwards, months afterwards, able to report to Corey that when she entered the room his father was sitting with his hat on his knees, a little tilted away from the Emancipation group, as if he expected the Lincoln to hit him, with that lifted hand of benediction, and that Mrs. Corey looked as if she were not sure but the eagle pecked. But for the time being Penelope was nearly crazed as might be by the complications of her position, and received her visitors with a piteous distraction which could not fail of touching Bromfield Corey's Italianized sympatheticism. He was very polite and tender with her at first, and ended by making a joke with her, to which Penelope responded in her sort. He said he hoped they parted friends, if not quite acquaintances, and she said she hoped they would be able to recognize each other if they ever met again. "This is what I meant by her pertness," said Mrs. Corey, when they were driving away. "Was it very pert?" he queried. "The child had to answer something." "I would much rather she had answered nothing under the circumstances," said Mrs. Corey. "However," she added hopelessly. "Oh, she's a merry little grig, you can see that, and there's no harm in her. I can understand why a formal fellow like Tom should be taken with her. She hasn't the least reverence, I suppose, and joked with the young man from the beginning. You must remember, Anna, that there was a time when you liked my joking." "It was a very different thing." "But that drawing-room," pursued Corey. "Really, I don't see how Tom stands that. Anna, a terrible thought occurs to me. Fancy Tom being married in front of that group, with a floral horseshoe and tuberoses coming down on either side of it." "Bromfield!" cried his wife, "you are unmerciful." "No, no, my dear," he argued, "merely imaginative. And I can even imagine that little thing finding Tom just the least bit slow, at times, if it were not for his goodness. Tom is so kind that I'm convinced he sometimes feels your joke in his heart when his head isn't quite clear about it. Well, we will not despond, my dear." "Your father seemed actually to like her," Mrs. Corey reported to her daughters, very much shaken in her own prejudices by the fact. If the girl were not so offensive to his fastidiousness, there might be some hope that she was not so offensive as Mrs. Corey had thought. "I wonder how she will strike you," she concluded, looking from one daughter to another, as if trying to decide which of them would like Penelope least. Irene's return and the visit of the Coreys formed a distraction for the Laphams in which their impending troubles seemed to hang further aloof, but it was only one of those reliefs which mark the course of adversity, and it was not one of the cheerful reliefs. At any other time, either incident would have been an anxiety and care for Mrs. Lapham, which she would have found hard to bear, but now she almost welcomed them. At the end of 3 days Lapham returned, and his wife met him as if nothing unusual had marked their parting. She reserved her atonement for a fitter time. He would know now from the way she acted that she felt all right towards him. He took very little note of her manner, but met his family with an austere quiet that puzzled her, and a sort of pensive dignity that refined his rudeness to an effect that sometimes comes to such natures after long sickness, when the animal strength has been taxed and lowered. He sat silent with her at the table after their girls had left them alone, and seeing that he did not mean to speak, she began to explain why Irene had come home, and to praise her. "Yes, she done right," said Lapham. "It was time for her to come," he added gently. Then he was silent again, and his wife told him of Corey's having been there, and of his father's and mother's calling. "I guess Pen's concluded to make it up," she said. "Well, we'll see about that," said Lapham, and now she could no longer forbear to ask him about his affairs. "I don't know as I've got any right to know anything about it," she said humbly, with remote allusion to her treatment of him. "But I can't help wanting to know. How are things going, Si?" "Bad," he said, pushing his plate from him, and tilting himself back in his chair. "Or they ain't going at all. They've stopped." "What do you mean, Si?" she persisted, tenderly. "I've got to the end of my string. Tomorrow I shall call a meeting of my creditors, and put myself in their hands. If there's enough left to satisfy them, I'm satisfied." His voice dropped in his throat. He swallowed once or twice, and then did not speak. "Do you mean that it's all over with you?" she asked fearfully. He bowed his big head, wrinkled and grizzled, and after a while he said, "It's hard to realize it, but I guess there ain't any doubt about it." He drew a long breath, and then he explained to her about the West Virginia people, and how he had got an extension of the first time they had given him, and had got a man to go up to Lapham with him and look at the works, a man that had turned up in New York and wanted to put money in the business. His money would have enabled Lapham to close with the West Virginians. "The devil was in it right straight along," said Lapham. "All I had to do was keep quiet about that other company. It was Rogers and his property right over again. He liked the look of things, and he wanted to go into the business, and he had money, plenty. It would have saved me with those West Virginia folks. But I had to tell 'em how I stood. I had to tell 'em all about it, and what I wanted to do. He began to backwater in a minute, and the next morning I saw that it was up with him. He's gone back to New York. I've lost my chance. Now all I've got to do is save the pieces." Will everything go?" she asked. "I can't tell yet. But they shall have a chance at everything. Every dollar, every cent. I'm sorry for you, Persis, and the girls." "Oh, don't talk of us." She was trying to realize that the simple, rude soul to which her heart clove in her youth, but which she had put to such cruel proof with her unsparing conscience and her unsparing tongue, had been equal to its ordeals, and had come out unscathed and unstained. He was able in his talk to make so little of them. He hardly seemed to see what they were. He was apparently not proud of them, and certainly not glad. If they were victories of any sort, he bore them with the patience of defeat. His wife wished to praise him, but she did not know how, so she offered him a little reproach, in which alone she touched the cause of her behavior at parting. "Silas," she asked after a long gaze at him, "why didn't you tell me you had Jim Millen's girl there?" "I didn't suppose you'd like it, Persis," he answered. "I did intend to tell you at first, but then I put it off. I thought you'd come round some day and find it out for yourself." "I'm punished," said his wife, "for not taking enough interest in your business to even come near it. If we're brought back to the day of small things, I guess it's a lesson for me, Silas." "Oh, I don't know about the lesson," he said wearily. That night she showed him the anonymous scrawl which had kindled her fury against him. He turned it listlessly over in his hand. "I guess I know who it's from," he said, giving it back to her. "And I guess you do too, Persis." "But how could he?" "Mebbe he believed it," said Lapham, with patience that cut her more keenly than any reproach. "You did." Perhaps because the process of his ruin had been so gradual, perhaps because the excitement of preceding events had exhausted their capacity for emotion, the actual consummation of his bankruptcy brought a relief, a repose to Lapham and his family, rather than a fresh sensation of calamity. In the shadow of his disaster they returned to something like their old united life. They were at least all together again, and it will be intelligible to those whom life has blessed with vicissitude that Lapham should come home the evening after he had given up everything to his creditors, and should sit down to his supper so cheerful that Penelope could joke him in the old way, and tell him that she thought from his looks that they had concluded to pay him 100 cents on every dollar he owed them. As James Bellingham had taken so much interest in his troubles from the first, Lapham thought he ought to tell him, before taking the final step, just how things stood with him, and what he meant to do. Bellingham made some futile inquiries about his negotiations with the West Virginians, and Lapham told him they had come to nothing. He spoke of the New York man, and the chance that he might have sold out half his business to him. "But of course I had to let him know how it was about those fellows." "Of course," said Bellingham, not seeing till afterwards the full significance of Lapham's action. All those who were concerned in his affairs said he behaved well, and even more than well, when it came to the worst. The prudence, the good sense which he had shown in the first years of his success, and of which his great prosperity seemed to have bereft him, came back, and these qualities, used in his own behalf, commended him as much to his creditors as the anxiety he showed that no one should suffer by him. This even made some of them doubtful of his sincerity. They gave him time, and there would have been no trouble in his resuming on the old basis if the ground had not been cut from under him by the competition of the West Virginia Company. He saw himself that it was useless to try to go on in the old way, and he preferred to go back and begin the world anew where he had first begun it, in the hills at Lapham. He put the house at Nankeen Square, with everything else he had, into the payment of his debts, and Mrs. Lapham found it easier to leave it for the old farmstead in Vermont than it would have been to go from that home of many years to the new house on the waterside of Beacon. This thing and that is embittered to us, so that we may be willing to relinquish it. The world, life itself, is embittered to most of us, so that we are glad to have done with them at last. And this home was haunted with such memories to each of those who abandoned it, that to go was less exile than escape. Mrs. Lapham could not look into Irene's room without seeing the girl there before her glass, tearing the poor little keepsakes of her hapless fancy from their hiding-places to take them and fling them in passionate renunciation upon her sister. She could not come to the sitting-room, where her little ones had grown up, without starting at the thought of her husband sitting so many weary nights at his desk there, trying to fight his way back to hope out of the ruin into which he was slipping. When she remembered the night that Rogers came, she hated the place. Irene accepted her release from the house eagerly, and was glad to go before and prepare for the family at Lapham. Penelope was always ashamed of her engagement there. It must seem better somewhere else, and she was glad to go too. No one but Lapham, in fact, felt the pang of parting in all its keenness. Whatever regret the others had was softened to them by the likeness of their flitting to many of those removals for the summer which they had made in the late spring when they left Nankeen Square. They were going directly into the country instead of to the seaside first. But Lapham, who usually remained in town after they had gone, knew all the difference. For his nerves there was no mechanical sense of coming back. This was as much the end of his proud, prosperous life as death itself could have been. He was returning to begin life anew, but he knew as well as he knew that he should not find his vanished youth in his native hills, that it could never again be the triumph that it had been. That was impossible, not only in his stiffened and weakened forces, but in the very nature of things. He was going back, by grace of the man whom he owed money, to make what he could out of the one chance which his successful rivals had left him. In one phase his paint had held its own against bad times and ruinous competition, and it was with the hope of doing still more with the Persis brand that he now set himself to work. The West Virginia people confessed that they could not produce those fine grades, and they willingly left the field to him. A strange, not ignoble friendliness existed between Lapham and the three brothers. They had used him fairly. It was their facilities that had conquered him, not their ill will, and he recognized in them without enmity the necessity to which he had yielded. If he succeeded in his efforts to develop his paint in this direction, it must be for a long time on a small scale compared with his former business, which it could never equal, and he brought to them the flagging energies of an elderly man. He was more broken than he knew by his failure. It did not kill, as it often does, but it weakened the spring once so strong and elastic. He lapsed more and more into acquiescence with his changed condition, and that bragging note of his was rarely sounded. He worked faithfully enough in his enterprise, but sometimes he failed to seize occasions that in his younger days he would have turned to golden account. His wife saw in him a daunted look that made her heart ache for him. One result of his friendly relations with the West Virginia people was that Corey went in with them, and the fact that he did so solely upon Lapham's advice and by means of his recommendation was perhaps the Colonel's proudest consolation. Corey knew the business thoroughly, and after half a year at Kanawha Falls and in the office at New York, he went out to Mexico and Central America to see what could be done for them on the ground which he had theoretically studied with Lapham. Before he went he came up to Vermont and urged Penelope to go with him. He was to be first in the city of Mexico, and if his mission was successful he was to be kept there and in South America several years, watching the new railroad enterprises and the development of mechanical agriculture and whatever other undertakings offered an opening for the introduction of the paint. They were all young men together, and Corey, who had put his money into the company, had a proprietary interest in the success which they were eager to achieve. "There's no more reason now, and no less than there ever was," mused Penelope, in council with her mother, "why I should say yes or why I should say no. Everything else changes, but this is just where it was a year ago. It don't go backward and it don't go forward. Mother, I believe I shall take the bit in my teeth, if anybody will put it there." "It isn't the same as it was," suggested her mother. "You can see that Irene's all over it." "That's no credit to me," said Penelope. "I ought to be just as much ashamed as ever." "You no need ever to be ashamed." "That's true, too," said the girl. "And I can sneak off to Mexico with a good conscience if I could make my mind up to it," she laughed. "Well, if I could be sentenced to be married, or somebody would up and forbid the banns. I don't know what to do about it." Her mother left her to carry her hesitation back to Corey, and she said now they had better go all over it and try to reason it out. and I hope that whatever I do, it won't be for my own sake, but for others." Corey said he was sure of that, and looked at her with eyes of patient tenderness. "I don't say it is wrong," she proceeded, rather aimlessly, "but I can't make it seem right. I don't know whether I can make you understand, but the idea of being happy, when everybody else is so miserable, is more than I can endure. It makes me wretched." "Then perhaps that's your share of the common suffering," suggested Corey, smiling. "Oh, you know it isn't. You know it's nothing. Oh, one of the reasons is what I told you once before, that as long as father is in trouble I can't let you think of me. Now that he's lost everything?" She bent her eyes inquiringly upon him, as if for the effect of this argument. "I don't think that's a very good reason," he answered seriously, but smiling still. "Do you believe me when I tell you that I love you?" "Why, I suppose I must," she said, dropping her eyes. "Then why shouldn't I think all the more of you on account of your father's loss? You didn't suppose I cared for you because he was prosperous?" There was a shade of reproach, ever so delicate and gentle in his smiling question, which she felt. "No, I couldn't think such a thing of you. I don't know what I meant. I meant that—" She could not go on and say that she had felt herself more worthy of him because of her father's money. It would not have been true, yet there was no other explanation. She stopped and cast a helpless glance at him. He came to her aid. "I understand why you shouldn't wish me to suffer by your father's misfortunes." "Yes, that was it. And there's too great a difference every way. We ought to look at that again. You mustn't pretend that you don't know it, for that wouldn't be true. Your mother will never like me, and perhaps I shall not like her." "Well," said Corey, a little daunted, "you won't have to marry my family." "Ah, that isn't the point." "I know it," he admitted. "I won't pretend that I don't see what you mean, but I'm sure that all the differences would disappear when you come to know my family better. I'm not afraid but you and my mother will like each other. She can't help it," he exclaimed, less judicially than he had hitherto spoken, and he went on to urge some points of doubtful tenability. "We have our ways, and you have yours, and while I don't say but what you and my mother and sisters would be a little strange together at first, it would soon wear off on both sides. There can't be anything hopelessly different in you all. It wouldn't be any difference to me." "Do you think it would be pleasant to have you on my side against your mother?" "There won't be any sides. Just tell me what it is you're afraid of." "Afraid?" "Thinking of, then." "I don't know. It isn't anything they say or do," she explained, with her eyes intent on his. "It's what they are. I couldn't be natural with them, and if I can't be natural with people, I'm disagreeable." "Can you be natural with me?" "Oh, I'm not afraid of you. I never was. That was the trouble from the beginning." "Well, then, that's all that's necessary. And it never was the least trouble to me." "It made me untrue to Irene." "You mustn't say that. You were always true to her." "She cared for you first." "Well, but I never cared for her at all," he besought her. "She thought you did." "That was nobody's fault, and I can't let you make it yours." "My dear—" "Wait. We must understand each other," said Penelope, rising from her seat to prevent an advance he was making from his. "I want you to realize the whole affair. Should you want a girl who hadn't a cent in the world, and felt different in your mother's company, and had cheated and betrayed her own sister?" "I want you." "Very well, then, you can't have me. I should always despise myself. I ought to give you up for all these reasons. Yes, I must." She looked at him intently, and there was a tentative quality in her affirmations. "Is this your answer?" he said. "I must submit. If I asked too much of you, I was wrong. And good-bye." He held out his hand, and she put hers in it. "You think I'm capricious and fickle," she said. "I can't help it. I don't know myself. I can't keep to one thing for half a day at a time. But it's right for us to part. Yes, it must be. It must be," she repeated, "and I shall try to remember that. Good-bye. I will try to keep that in mind, and you will too. You won't care very soon. I didn't mean that. No, I know how true you are, but you will soon look at me differently, and see that even if there hadn't been this about Irene, I was not the one for you. You do think so, don't you?" she pleaded, clinging to his hand. "I'm not at all what they would like, your family. I felt that. I am little and black and homely, and they don't understand my way of talking, and now that we've lost everything—no, I'm not fit. Good-bye. You're quite right, not to have patience with me any longer. I've tried you enough. I ought to be willing to marry you against their wishes if you want me to, but I can't make the sacrifice. I'm too selfish for that." All at once she flung herself on his breast. "I can't even give you up. I shall never dare look anyone in the face again. Go, go, but take me with you. I tried to do it without you. I gave it a fair trial, and it was a dead failure. Oh, poor Irene! How could she give you up?" Corey went back to Boston immediately, and left Penelope, as he must, to tell her sister that they were to be married. She was spared from the first advance toward this by an accident or a misunderstanding. Irene came straight to her after Corey was gone, and demanded, "Penelope Lapham, have you been such a ninny as to send that man away on my account?" Penelope recoiled from this terrible courage. She did not answer directly, and Irene went on, "Because if you did, I'll thank you to bring him back again. I'm not going to have him thinking that I'm dying for a man that never cared for me. It's insulting, and I'm not going to stand it. Now you just send for him." "Oh, I will, 'Rene," gasped Penelope, and then she added, shamed out of her prevarication by Irene's haughty magnanimity, "I have. That is, he's coming back." Irene looked at her a moment, and then, whatever thought was in her mind, said fiercely, "Well!" and left her to her dismay and her relief, for they both knew that this was the last time that they should ever speak of that again. The marriage came after so much sorrow and trouble, and the fact was received with so much misgiving for the past and future, that it brought Lapham none of the triumph in which he had once exulted at the thought of an alliance with the Coreys. Adversity had so far been his friend that it had taken from him all hope of the social success for which people crawl and truckle, and restored him, through failure and doubt and heartache, the manhood which his prosperity had so nearly stolen from him. Neither he nor his wife thought now that their daughter was marrying a Corey. They thought only that she was giving herself to the man who loved her, and their acquiescence was sobered still further by the presence of Irene. Their hearts were far more with her. Again and again Mrs. Lapham said she did not see how she could go through with it. "I can't make it seem right," she said. "It is right," steadily answered the Colonel. "Yes, I know, but it don't seem so." It would be easy to point out traits in Penelope's character which finally reconciled all her husband's family and endeared her to them. These things continually happen in novels, and the Coreys, as they had always promised themselves to do, made the best and not the worst of Tom's marriage. They were people who could value Lapham's behavior as Tom reported it to them. They were proud of him, and Bromfield Corey, who found a delicate aesthetic pleasure in the heroism with which Lapham had withstood Rogers and his temptations, something finely dramatic and unconsciously effective, wrote him a letter which would once have flattered the rough soul almost to ecstasy, though he now affected to slight it in showing it. "It's all right if it makes it more comfortable for Pen," he said to his wife. But the differences remained uneffaced, if not uneffaceable, between the Coreys and Tom Corey's wife. If he had only married the Colonel, subtly suggested Nanny Corey. There was a brief season of civility and forbearance on both sides, when he brought her home before starting for Mexico, and her father-in-law made a sympathetic feint of liking Penelope's way of talking, but it is questionable if even he found it so delightful as her husband did. Lily Corey made a little ineffectual sketch of her, which she put by with other studies to finish up some time, and found her rather picturesque in some ways. Nanny got on with her better than the rest, and saw possibilities for her in the country to which she was going. "As she's quite unformed socially," she explained to her mother, "there is a chance that she will form herself on the Spanish manner, if she stays there long enough, and that when she comes back she will have the charm of, not olives perhaps, but tortillas, whatever they are, something strange and foreign, even if it's borrowed. I'm glad she's going to Mexico. At that distance we can correspond." Her mother sighed, and said bravely that she was sure they all got on very pleasantly as it was, and that she was perfectly satisfied if Tom was. There was, in fact, much truth in what she said of their harmony with Penelope. Having resolved from the beginning to make the best of the worst, it might almost be said that they were supported and consoled in their good intentions by a higher power. This marriage had not, thanks to an overruling Providence, brought the succession of Lapham teas upon Bromfield Corey which he had dreaded. The Laphams were far off in their native fastnesses, and neither Lily nor Nanny Corey was obliged to sacrifice herself to the conversation of Irene. They were not even called upon to make a social demonstration for Penelope at a time when, most people being still out of town, it would have been so easy. She and Tom had both begged that there might be nothing of that kind, and though none of the Coreys learned to know her very well in the week she spent with them, they did not find it hard to get on with her. There were even moments when Nanny Corey, like her father, had glimpses of what Tom had called her humor, but it was perhaps too unlike their own to be easily recognizable. Whether Penelope, on her side, found it more difficult to harmonize, I cannot say. She had much more of the harmonizing to do, since they were 4-1, but then she had gone through so much greater trials before. When the door of their carriage closed and it drove off with her and her husband to the station, she fetched a long sigh. "What is it?" asked Corey, who ought to have known better. "Oh, nothing. I don't think I shall feel strange amongst the Mexicans now." He looked at her with a puzzled smile, which grew a little graver, and then he put his arm round her and drew her closer to him. This made her cry on his shoulder. "I only meant that I should have you all to myself." There is no proof that she meant more, but it is certain that our manners and customs go for more in life than our qualities. The price that we pay for civilization is the fine, yet impassable differentiation of these. Perhaps we pay too much, but it will not be possible to persuade those who have the difference in their favor that this is so. They may be right, and at any rate, the blank misgiving, the recurring sense of disappointment to which the young people's departure left the Coreys is to be considered. That was the end of their son and brother for them. They felt that, and they were not mean or unamiable people. He remained 3 years away. Some changes took place in that time. One of these was the purchase by the Kanawha Falls Company of the mines and works at Lapham. The transfer relieved Lapham of the load of debt which he was still laboring under, and gave him an interest in the vaster enterprise of the younger men, which he had once vainly hoped to grasp all in his own hand. He began to tell of this coincidence as something very striking, and pushing on more actively the special branch of the business left to him, he bragged, quite in his old way, of its enormous extension. His son-in-law, he said, was pushing it in Mexico and Central America, an idea that they had originally had in common. Well, young blood was what they wanted in a thing of that kind. Now, those fellows out in West Virginia, all young and a perfect team. For himself, he owned that he had made mistakes. He could see just where the mistakes were. He put his finger right on them. But one thing he could say, he had been no man's enemy but his own. Every dollar, every cent had gone to pay his debts. He had come out with clean hands. He said all this and much more to Mr. Sewell the summer after he sold out, when the minister and his wife stopped at Lapham on their way across from the White Mountains to Lake Champlain. Lapham had found them on the cars and pressed them to stop off. There were times when Mrs. Lapham had as great pride in the clean-handedness with which Lapham had come out as he had himself, but her satisfaction was not so constant. At those times, knowing the temptations he had resisted, she thought him the noblest and grandest of men, but no woman could endure to live in the same house with a perfect hero, and there were other times when she reminded him that if he had kept his word to her about speculating in stocks, and had looked after the insurance of his property half as carefully as he had looked after a couple of worthless women who had no earthly claim on him, they would not be where they were now. He humbly admitted it all, and left her to think of Rogers herself. She did not fail to do so, and the thought did not fail to restore him to her tenderness again. I do not know how it is that clergymen and physicians keep from telling their wives the secrets confided to them. Perhaps they can trust their wives to find them out for themselves whenever they wish. Sewell had laid before his wife the case of the Laphams after they came to consult with him about Corey's proposal to Penelope, for he wished to be confirmed in his belief that he had advised them soundly. But he had not given her their names, and he had not known Corey's himself. Now he had no compunctions in talking the affair over with her without the veil of ignorance which she had hitherto assumed, for she declared that as soon as she heard of Corey's engagement to Penelope, the whole thing had flashed upon her. And that night at dinner I could have told the child that he was in love with her sister by the way he talked about her. I heard him, and if she had not been so blindly in love with him herself, she would have known it too. I must say I can't help feeling a sort of contempt for her sister." "Oh, but you must not," cried Sewell. "That is wrong, cruelly wrong. I'm sure that's out of your novel reading, my dear, and not out of your heart. Come, it grieves me to hear you say such a thing as that." "Oh, I dare say this pretty thing has got over it. How much character she has got! And I suppose she'll see somebody else." Sewell had to content himself with this partial concession. As a matter of fact, unless it was the young West Virginian who had come on to arrange the purchase of the works, Irene had not yet seen anyone, and whether there was ever anything between them is a fact that would need a separate inquiry. It is certain that at the end of 5 years after the disappointment which she had met so bravely, she was still unmarried. But she was even then still very young, and her life at Lapham had been varied by visits to the West. It had also been varied by an invitation made with the politest resolution by Mrs. Corey to visit in Boston, which the girl was equal to refusing in the same spirit. Sewell was intensely interested in the moral spectacle which Lapham presented under his changed conditions. The Colonel, who was more the Colonel in those hills than he ever could have been on the Back Bay, kept him and Mrs. Sewell overnight at his house, and he showed the minister minutely round the works and drove him all over his farm. For this expedition he employed a lively colt which had not yet come of age, and an open buggy long past its prime, and was no more ashamed of his turnout than of the finest he had ever driven on the mill dam. He was rather shabby and slovenly in dress, and he had fallen unkempt, after the country fashion, as to his hair and beard and boots. The house was plain, and was furnished with the simpler movables out of the house in Nankeen Square. There were certainly all the necessaries, but no luxuries unless the statues of prayer and faith might be so considered. The Laphams now burned kerosene, of course, and they had no furnace in the winter. These were the only hardships the Colonel complained of. But he said that as soon as the company got to paying dividends again, he was evidently proud of the outlays that for the present prevented this, he should put in steam heat and nap the gas. He spoke freely of his failure, and with a confidence that seemed inspired by his former trust in Sewell, whom, indeed, he treated like an intimate friend rather than acquaintance of 2 or 3 meetings. He went back to his first connection with Rogers, and he put before Sewell hypothetically his own conclusions in regard to the matter. "Sometimes," he said, "I get to thinking it all over, and it seems to me I done wrong about Rogers in the first place, that the whole trouble came from that. It was just like starting a row of bricks. I tried to catch up and stop 'em from going, but they all tumbled, one after another. It wa'n't in the nature of things that they could be stopped till the last brick went. I don't talk much with my wife any more about it, but I should like to know how it strikes you." "We can trace the operation of evil in the physical world," replied the minister, "but I'm more and more puzzled about it in the moral world. There its course is often so very obscure, and often it seems to involve, so far as we can see, no penalty whatever. And in your own case, as I understand, you don't admit, you don't feel sure, that you ever actually did wrong this man." "Well, I don't know. That is to say—" He did not continue, and after a while Sewell said, with that subtle kindness of his, "I should be inclined to think nothing can be thrown quite away, and it can't be that our sins only weaken us, that your fear of having possibly behaved selfishly toward this man kept you on your guard, and strengthened you when you were brought face to face with a greater—" he was going to say temptation, but he saved Lapham's pride and said, "emergency." "Do you think so?" "I think that there may be truth in what I suggest." "Well, I don't know what it was," said Lapham. "All I know is that when it come to the point, although I could see that I'd got to go under unless I did it, that I couldn't sell out to those Englishmen, and I couldn't let that man put his money into my business without I told him just how things stood.
End of chapter 27. End